September 23, 1939, marked yet another grim day in the rapidly concluding Polish campaign of World War II. As the German siege of Warsaw continued with brutal efficiency and the Soviet occupation of eastern Poland became more entrenched, Poland's fate as a sovereign nation appeared increasingly sealed. The unfolding events highlighted the brutalities of occupation, the strategic maneuvers of the Axis and Soviet powers, and the mounting pressures on the Allied nations to respond to a crisis that was reshaping the geopolitical landscape of Europe. Globally, the day's developments prompted widespread reflection on the catastrophic failures of appeasement and the grim realities of totalitarian aggression. The Siege of Warsaw, the last stand. By September 23, Warsaw's situation had grown even more desperate. The German Wehrmacht, having surrounded the city and severed all lines of supply and communication, continued to tighten the noose around the Polish capital. The relentless bombardment from the Luftwaffe and German artillery had reduced much of Warsaw to rubble, leaving the city's defenders and civilians in dire straits. Food and medical supplies were nearly depleted, and the civilian population faced starvation and disease as the siege wore on. Inside Warsaw, the defenders, comprising regular Polish army units, local militias, and civilian volunteers, continued to resist with remarkable tenacity despite the overwhelming odds against them. Under the leadership of General Walerian Chuma and Mayor Stefan Starzyński, efforts were made to organize what remained of the city's defenses and to prepare for the inevitable end. Starzyński's radio broadcasts, once a symbol of hope and defiance, had taken on a more somber tone, reflecting the harsh reality that Warsaw could not hold out much longer against the German onslaught. On September 23, German forces prepared for what they hoped would be the final push to capture Warsaw. The Wehrmacht intensified its artillery barrages and airstrikes, targeting any remaining defensive positions and attempting to force a surrender. Leaflets were dropped over the city, urging the defenders to capitulate to avoid further destruction and loss of life. For the exhausted defenders and civilians, the pressure to surrender was immense, but many remained determined to resist as long as possible, holding out for any hope of relief from the Allies or a miracle that might turn the tide of battle. Soviet occupation, further consolidation and repression. While Warsaw braced for its final moments, the Soviet Union continued to solidify its control over eastern Poland. Following their swift advance into the region after the invasion on September 17, Soviet forces encountered little organized resistance, allowing them to move quickly to establish Soviet authority. The occupation was characterized by a combination of military presence and administrative overhaul, aimed at integrating eastern Poland into the Soviet system. On September 23, Soviet authorities accelerated their efforts to impose control over the occupied territories. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, intensified its campaign of repression, targeting anyone suspected of anti-Soviet sentiment or nationalist sympathies. Thousands of Polish military officers, civil servants, landowners, and intellectuals were arrested and deported to labor camps in Siberia and other remote areas of the Soviet Union. These actions were part of a broader strategy to eliminate any potential resistance and to secure Soviet dominance in the region. In addition to political repression, the Soviets continued to implement economic and social reforms designed to transform eastern Poland according to communist principles. Industries were nationalized, agricultural land was collectivized, and Soviet propaganda was disseminated widely to enforce loyalty to the new regime. For the local Polish population, the Soviet occupation represented a harsh new reality, marked by fear, repression, and the erasure of their national identity. German occupation, strengthening control in the West. In western Poland, the German occupation forces continued to assert their authority over the newly conquered territories. With the rapid defeat of Polish forces, the Wehrmacht focused on establishing a stable occupation regime that would serve both military and economic needs. The German occupation was characterized by a combination of military control, administrative restructuring, and economic exploitation. On September 23, German authorities implemented further measures aimed at consolidating their control over occupied Poland. Martial law was strictly enforced, and the Gestapo expanded its efforts to root out any remaining resistance. Polish intellectuals, military officers, and political leaders were systematically targeted for arrest and execution, as the Germans sought to crush any potential sources of dissent. The occupation also involved significant economic exploitation. Forced labor was imposed on the Polish population, with thousands sent to work in German factories, farms, and infrastructure projects essential to the Nazi war effort. The German authorities also continued their policy of Germanization, which involved the displacement of Polish populations and the resettlement of ethnic Germans in their place. This policy aimed to create a loyal German populace in the occupied territories while eradicating Polish cultural and national identity. German propaganda continued to frame the invasion of Poland as a defensive measure necessary to protect Germany from external threats and secure its eastern borders. This narrative was used to justify the harsh measures being implemented in the occupied territories and to maintain domestic support for the war effort. For the Polish population, the German occupation represented a period of intense suffering and repression, marked by violence, coercion, and systematic attempts to eradicate Polish identity. Allied response, strategic confusion, and calls for action. As the situation in Poland deteriorated further, the Allied powers, particularly the United Kingdom and France, faced increasing pressure to take more decisive action. The complete occupation of Poland by German and Soviet forces underscored the failures of Allied policy and raised urgent questions about the future course of the war. In the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's government faced growing criticism for its perceived failure to act decisively in defense of Poland. Public opinion was increasingly skeptical of the government's ability to manage the crisis, with many feeling that Britain had not fulfilled its obligations to its Polish ally. On September 23, the British War Cabinet continued to debate potential responses, including the possibility of increasing military aid to other nations threatened by Axis aggression and expanding economic sanctions against both Germany and the Soviet Union. However, logistical challenges and concerns about military readiness continued to constrain the British response. The Royal Air Force, RAF, focused on defensive preparations, while the Royal Navy maintained its blockade of Germany in an effort to weaken the Nazi war machine through economic attrition. The British government also explored ways to support Polish forces that had escaped to France and other countries, recognizing the need to keep the Polish cause alive even as Poland itself fell under occupation. In France, the government of Prime Minister Édouard Daladier faced similar challenges. The French military, heavily focused on defending the Maginot Line and preparing for a potential German offensive in the west, was not in a position to intervene directly in Poland. The French public, like their British counterparts, was increasingly frustrated with the government's perceived lack of decisive action. The complete occupation of Poland forced France to reassess its strategic priorities and how best to support the Allied cause in an increasingly hostile environment. The failure of the Allies to provide more substantial support to Poland highlighted broader strategic dilemmas. Both the British and French governments were wary of provoking a broader conflict before they were fully prepared. But this cautious approach also meant that Poland had been left to face the German and Soviet onslaught largely alone. The events of September 23 underscored the limitations of the Allied military and diplomatic strategies and the need for a more coordinated and decisive approach to countering the Axis and Soviet threats. International reactions, diplomatic maneuvers, and strategic recalculations. The continued occupation of Poland by German and Soviet forces and the imminent fall of Warsaw prompted strong reactions from the international community. Many nations began to reassess their positions and strategies in response to the rapidly changing landscape of the war. In the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt maintained a stance of neutrality but was increasingly aware of the potential implications of the conflict for global stability. On September 23, discussions within the U.S. government continued to focus on expanding support to the Allies, including economic and material aid through measures like the cash-and-carry policy. This policy, allowing belligerents to purchase arms from the U.S. provided they transported the goods themselves, gained further support as a means of aiding Britain and France while maintaining American neutrality. In Italy, Benito Mussolini's regime continued to advocate for a negotiated peace, positioning Italy as a potential mediator in the conflict. On September 23, Mussolini reiterated his proposal for an international conference to resolve the war, seeking to bolster Italy's diplomatic standing while avoiding direct involvement in the conflict. However, this offer was largely dismissed by the Western Allies, who viewed it as an attempt to weaken their resolve and buy time for the Axis powers. Other neutral nations, such as Switzerland, Sweden, and the Netherlands, continued to bolster their defenses and prepare for potential spillover from the conflict. These countries, aware of their strategic positions and vulnerabilities, sought to maintain their neutrality while preparing for potential threats from both the Axis and Allied powers. The situation was particularly tense in Belgium and the Netherlands, where fears of German invasion prompted increased military readiness and diplomatic efforts to secure guarantees of neutrality. Media coverage and global public opinion. On September 23rd, media coverage around the world continued to focus on the dramatic events unfolding in Poland and the broader strategic implications of the war. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and newsreels provided updates on the military situation and the responses of the belligerent nations, shaping public perceptions and understanding of the conflict. In the United Kingdom, the BBC and major newspapers like The Times and The Daily Telegraph reported on the continued siege of Warsaw and the firm establishment of Soviet control in eastern Poland with a sense of urgency and condemnation. Coverage emphasized the plight of the Polish people and the need for a more robust Allied response. Editorials called for increased support for other potential victims of Axis aggression and debated the merits of launching an offensive against Germany versus continuing a more cautious approach. In France, newspapers such as Le Figaro and Le Monde highlighted the humanitarian crisis in Warsaw and the broader implications of the Soviet and German occupations. The French press reflected the public's growing anxiety and frustration with the government's perceived lack of decisive action. Opinion pieces called for greater coordination with the British and a more aggressive stance to support Poland, while others warned of the risks of escalating the conflict without adequate preparation. In Germany, state-controlled media continued to portray the invasion of Poland as a necessary and justified action, emphasizing the successes of the Wehrmacht and the righteousness of Germany's actions. Propaganda outlets like Völkischer Beobachter and Der Angriff highlighted the military victories and portrayed the campaign as a defensive struggle against foreign aggression. The propaganda aimed to maintain public morale and support for the war effort, even as the realities of a prolonged conflict began to take shape. In the Soviet Union, state media maintained a narrative of neutrality and defense, presenting the invasion as a necessary step to protect ethnic minorities and restore order in Eastern Europe. Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts portrayed the Red Army as liberators, bringing stability and protection to the peoples of the eastern regions of Poland. This narrative was designed to justify the Soviet actions both domestically and internationally, framing the intervention as a necessary step to prevent further chaos and bloodshed. Strategic implications and the road ahead. The events of September 23, 1939, underscored the rapidly changing dynamics of the conflict and the strategic dilemmas faced by all parties involved. For Poland, the day marked a further descent into occupation and repression, as the fall of Warsaw seemed imminent and the country was effectively divided between two totalitarian powers. The Allied powers faced a complex set of challenges as they grappled with how best to respond to the dual threats of Nazi Germany and Soviet expansionism. For the United Kingdom and France, the day highlighted the difficulties of coalition warfare and the challenges of transitioning from peace to war. Both nations were still adjusting to the realities of a conflict they had hoped to avoid and were faced with strategic uncertainties regarding how best to respond to the expanding scope of the war. The debates over offensive versus defensive strategies, and the extent to which they could and should support other nations threatened by Axis aggression, reflected broader tensions within the Allied leadership that would continue to shape the early phases of the war. Conclusion: a war deepening and global stakes rising. September 23, 1939, was a day of profound significance, as the continued siege of Warsaw and the consolidation of Soviet control over eastern Poland highlighted the brutal realities of the Second World War. The events of this day underscored the challenges of coalition warfare, the limits of pre-war planning and preparation, and the unpredictable nature of a conflict that was beginning to engulf much of Europe and threaten global stability.